Thank you very much. It really gives me great pleasure to be here. My father was a naval aviator, and in December 1941, after quite a tough time in Malta, he was in Jamaica, and after Pearl Harbor, he was told to go over to the US and give some advice. There seems to be no trace of this advice. All I can find is a picture of him dancing for war bonds in New Jersey. So he did make a contribution. It's a great, I was enormously grateful, as you might imagine, for Admiral Greenet for his kind words about my book. And encouraging you to read it. Indeed, it may even have been an order. I wasn't quite sure. But it was particularly comforting because I don't think what I'm going to say is going to be enormously at variance with what he says. It's one thing about giving advice. It's another thing about contradicting the Chief of Naval Operations. But I think what I'm going to say is going to follow, but it's slightly different. And it's really to challenge some of the ways that we do think about strategy and try to suggest some ways forward. And I will indeed talk about the Geminian aspects of this. Strategy offers some sort of confidence that with the right measures, demanding objectives can be achieved on a regular basis. And that's how the word tends to be used. And there's a constant demand for more and better strategy and a common lament that it has become neglected by our leaders. They're chastised for being myopic and short-term, and if only they could rediscover the importance of strategy, then the country could be inspired by a vision and resources would be geared to well-crafted but realistic goals. Without strategy, it would appear policy is doomed, it's going to be coherent and inchoate, and insert this magic ingredient and everything will fall into place. Sometimes it appears as if almost any strategy will do, because at least then there will be clarity, although, of course, the demands for a strategy often have a very strong view of what the strategy would look like. Now, in all of this, I'm a skeptic. Russia and China may have a view about a world that would be better accommodated to their interests, but the Americans and the British are essentially status quo powers. And so their grand visions are always going to look like improved versions of the present with some of the nasty bits taken away. Also, we've got to be realistic about how strategy is going to come together. We shouldn't dismiss normal organizational practices of muddling through trial and error and consider them astrategic, as the CNO explained. Budgets do inevitably drive strategy, and they do force people to make choices and work out their priorities. There's always going to be a need to forge consensus amongst government departments, negotiate with allies, and anticipate opponents. And nor should we feel contemptuous if politicians worry about public opinion and future elections. They're the ones who have to explain the links between distant events and national well-being. Kennedy speechwriter Ted Sorensen concluded that the quarantine was the best response to missiles in Cuba in 1962 because he couldn't write the alternative speech explaining airstrikes. There was a time when the big decisions of peace and war were matters for high policy and the public was excluded. This was the case, for example, in July 1914. Well, if political leaders had been required to make a compelling case to their people at that time, they might have been more careful in their choices. Autocrats often make terrible decisions, precisely because they don't have to worry about accountability, and those around them are too scared to make a challenge. So we have to be careful to avoid this sort of reification of strategy as some super intelligent product around which all activity can be organized. It's about shifting political relationships and how to get the best outcome out of them. If strategy is presented as the setting of noble and ambitious objectives, we then find ourselves working backwards to work out how we can get there. We formulate a plan, a sequence of steps, that is supposed to get us to the desired place. Von Moltke's famous observation was that no plan survives contact with the enemy. I opened my book with Mike Tyson. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. It's the same basic problem. My argument is that we should recognize that whatever our goals, not saying we shouldn't have them by any means, strategy in the first instance will always be shaped by current circumstances and start with the specific problem at hand. And if there's no pressing problem, there'll be an absence of strategy. This is why, for status quo powers, strategy as often as not is quite reactive. In fact, we can distinguish, I think, between strategy as sort of an orientation to our environment, which is something that can be written down in documents and thought about, and then strategy as a campaign, which is how I think the military inevitably are often going to think about it. I think these are two different ways of thinking about strategy. Obviously, if you thought about your environment properly, then your campaign should be getting off to a better start. But the two are different. And a strategy as a campaign can result either from a radical objective, a readiness yourself to destabilize the environment, or because somebody else has destabilized it, and then it becomes a much more defensive reaction. Either way, in my view, it's likely to move forward in stages, each changing the environment and therefore requiring different response as one stage closes off and another one opens, and new possibilities arrive, as well as old options no longer being available. So it's an argument basically for flexibility and a degree of improvisation. Now, what I want to do in this lecture is take this view of strategy and look at the problems, particularly for a campaigning strategy, that this creates for the armed forces. Before embarking on a campaign, we're told that the military like clear objectives. They like clear objectives to be set. They want victory rather than a draw, certainly not a defeat. The enemy must be left with no way back, obliged to surrender and comply with our wishes. Now, this view draws on a long-established conceptual framework. I call this the classical model, largely because it derives quite explicitly from the classical works in our field. Even the more influential contemporary writers on strategic theory, John Boyd, Ed Luttwak, Colin Gray, place themselves clearly in this classical tradition. It's a striking feature of our field. One can't imagine a contemporary business strategist insisting on the primacy of early 19th century text when marketing new products or launching a takeover bid. A political strategist would find a guide to election campaigns from the 19th century quaint, but no more of historical interest. Yet few self-respecting military strategists feel able to ignore Clausewitz. Many will go back to Sun Tzu. The daringly modern might get as far as Basil Littlehart from the middle of the last century. Now, there's good reason for this. Military strategy is still dominated by major wars, and these are rare events. The most substantial were the Napoleonic Wars, which inspired the classics, and then the First and Second World Wars, one of which began 100 years ago, and the second of which ended 69 years ago. The arrival of nuclear weapons encouraged truly innovative thinking, but this was more concerned with deterring wars than fighting them. And the other subfield has been guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency, which has had its own revival over the past decade. But by and large, these have been seen as diversions from core business. The reassertion of classical military strategy in the 1970s was in some respects a reaction against the prevalence of a deterrence mentality in official thinking and the miserable experience of Vietnam. Although this reassertion was described in terms of military reform, in key respects it was reactionary. The ideal type of military practice was found well in the past, in forms of warfare that pitted regular forces against each other, prized inspired commanders, kept non-combatants out of the frame, and assumed that the fate of nations would be determined by the result. The complaint from the reformers was that decades of preoccupation with irregular forms of warfare had led to the neglect of the classical warfare. And at the senior levels, they said that generalship had become about management, management had superseded generalship, and systems analysis had superseded strategy. They'd come to see warfare not as a chance to display the arts of higher command, but as a grand scheme of accounting with firepower as currency and body counts as outputs. This critique found a responsive audience as the American armed forces sought to rebuild after Vietnam. The classical approach was embraced, reflected in demands for more maneuver and less attrition, captured in field manuals and doctrinal developments such as air-land battle. And in this approach, we can note the influence of a number of great figures from the past. From Jomini, a conviction that battle could be decisive. From the elder von Moltke, a belief that the operational conduct of war should be free from political interference. From Sun Tzu and Little Hart, a preference for maneuver over attrition. And from Clausewitz, a description of military objectives in terms of centers of gravity. The context was the return to was the Cold War and the residual possibility of a Third World War. The adversary in mind was the Warsaw Pact, with its substantial armies and doctrines that can also be traced back to the 19th century thinking. The Soviet focus on the operational art and maneuver helped validate the Western approach. If these two great forces had clashed, they would have been prepared to fight along comparable lines, at least until the nuclear question came to be asked. But since the end of the Cold War, there's been good reasons to doubt whether there will be another major war of this type, and therefore whether these concepts will be of relevance. Meanwhile, issues of nuclear deterrence and counter-insurgency remain. Furthermore, we've had examples of force being used in a great variety of distinctive ways for purposes of coercion, to establish new facts on the ground that don't fit neatly into these established approaches. New forms of conflict, cyber war, for example, are actively being explored. And from this one might conclude that the problem of the classical model is simply one of obsolescence. This is the suggestion, for example, behind claims that we've now entered a fourth generation of warfare. But that's not my argument. I'm not saying that we should ignore the classics, or alternatively, that they're now being rendered irrelevant as a result of some transformation in warfare. The activities associated with the fourth generation, for example, can be traced back to centuries, while the possibility of major war still animates military preparations, and it's not too difficult to think of contingencies where it might come back. Anyway, amongst the adherents of the classical model, there's no suggestion that it is only for major war. It's created expectations for the conduct of all conflicts of which the armed forces are employed. My argument, instead, is that there is a flaw in the model derived from the classics, one that's been there from the start and has always caused problems. The flaw lies in the separation of the military and political strands of strategy. In ancient times, individuals combined the two, and of course, they were also combined in the single person of Napoleon, although he was much better at the military than the political. The separation of the two reflects the fact that there are distinct competences, so that their integration is always going to be a challenge for civil-military relations. Politicians who fancy themselves as generals have been almost as disastrous as generals who fancy themselves as politicians. The development of a special field that came to be known as strategy was a consequence of the steady professionalization of Western navies and armies and the increasingly complex tasks they faced in moving large fleets and mass armies, or in understanding the technical demands of their fields, whether in gunnery or siege.